Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Relationship and Truth, and today I'm going to be doing something that I don't normally do. I'm going to be interacting with part of a Wikipedia article, and like I said, that's not a normal thing for me to do. I generally do not have much of an interest in providing evidence and counter evidence to members of the Wikipedia thought police, and don't really have any intention of changing my mind on that particular policy. That being said, there was a friend of mine who contacted me and pointed out some of the things that were said on Wikipedia, and thought that it might be worthwhile to interact with it. And so that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to interact with that particular part that my friend showed me, and I would highly suggest for people that want to get into this topic in more depth that they look at some of the material that has been put out by Dr. James White on this subject. We're going to be talking about homosexuality in the New Testament. I would suggest that you look at some of the stuff that has been put out by Dr. James White on the topic, and also by Dr. Robert Gagnon. Both of them have done pretty outstanding work on this subject. I'm not sure, don't quote me on this, but I think that Dr. White actually co-authored the particular book that I'm thinking about that was on this subject of homosexuality in the church and what the Bible teaches and these kinds of things. And both of them have done stellar work in this regard. This is not to say that I agree with them in every single detail. I would probably agree, more generally speaking, with Dr. White than I would Dr. Gagnon in broader areas. But as to essential matters, both of them are relatively solid guys, and when it comes to this particular issue, both of them are quite accurate in being able to describe what the Bible actually does and does not teach regarding this particular topic. All right. So with that being out there, that this is not something that I plan on getting into in great depth. There are people out there who've done a whole lot more work on this than I have in much greater depth, specifically Dr. James White and Dr. Robert Gagnon. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take a look at this particular spot and provide an analysis and, to a certain extent, a rebuttal of it. Alright, so the general topic in Wikipedia is homosexuality in the Pauline epistles under the broader category of homosexuality in the New Testament. And the particular passage that they want us to look at is Romans 1:26 through 27. And the version that they quote in the text here is the English Majority Text Version, the EMTV, which is not exactly the scholarly accepted translation, by the way. Just the fact that it's majority text version means that it's not accepted by the majority of the scholarly consensus, because majority text, for those of you who don't know, is basically the accidental text of history. It is a text that became popularized following this in the 16th century and following. It was not necessarily indicative of what was had early on, and when people do critical analyses of what an ancient document says, they try to go for the most authentic and complete version of that document. It's not something that came literally 1,500 years later and was popularized because of translation, all idiosyncrasies and various historical accidents along the way. That is not something that scholars do. They try to interact with primary material in just as much as they can. And the English Majority Text Version does not represent original material in a scholarly sense. However, I do find it's very common that when people are trying to attack the Bible, they will usually not attack the Bible for what it actually says. They will usually attack the Bible based on misconceptions that are out there. And so a lot of times they will address popular forms of the text because a lot of misconceptions are based on that popular form of the text. But that's not a refutation of what the text itself says. That's a refutation of something that became popular later on. It's correcting a misconception. At best, it's not actually interacting with the original material. But in this particular case, it turns out that it isn't significantly different, so it's not going to matter here. But I have seen cases in other places where people who are trying to discredit Christianity will use a popular form of the text, say the King James Version or something else that is based on a majority text of some kind or another, or English translate, or a specific late English translation, something like that that is not overly accurate, and they'll attack some part in it that's not overly accurate and show how inaccurate it is, and think that that has somehow refuted Christianity, when all that it's done is pointed out that an errant translation is indeed errant, or an errant version is indeed errant. Okay, so I do find it odd that a lot of times these kinds of folks, even though this is not a scholarly version of the text, this is the form of the text that they choose to use. So just encountering that initially, it's one of the things that I notice oftentimes when they do this. Let's go ahead and take a look at the text that's under consideration. Like it says here, this is in Romans 1, 26 through 27. Paul is writing. Paul is writing, and in this translation he says, "For this reason, that is idolatry, God gave them up to passions of dishonor. For even their females exchanged the natural use of that which is contrary to nature. Exchanged the natural use for that which is contrary to nature. And likewise also the males, having left the natural use of the female, were inflamed by their lust for one another, males with males, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the recompense which was fitting for their error." And then Wikipedia's analysis of this is as follows. The Wikipedia article says, "The context is Paul's mission to the Gentiles, the gospel being to the Jew first, and also to the Greek," in a reference to Romans 1:16. And continuing with what Wikipedia says, they say, followed by a description of pagan idolatry in verses 1:21 through 25. So that is chapter 1, verses 21 through 25. The phrase passions of dishonor, which in the King James is vile affections, translates pathe, atemia, meaning dishonor, ignominy, disgrace. In the expressions natural use and contrary to nature, nature translates phusis, i.e. physis. The term error translates plane, literally straying or wandering. Okay, so why do they have this paragraph in here? It is talking about all these different words that it's translated from. Frankly, in terms of the actual analysis in and of itself, it's not overly relevant, unless you're trying to downplay the text as much as you can and make it as ambiguous as possible. And a lot of times in these kinds of articles, when they're talking about things like homosexuality and things that the world has become very comfortable with, that the Bible speaks against, they'll point out that, the Bible is using words here that have this general meaning. And it's fair to say that these words have this general meaning over here and this general meaning over here. The problem, though, is that every language is such that meaning is dependent on context, and meaning becomes more specific according to specific and technical usages within a specific and technical context. And so, while it is very interesting to point out the common general meaning of these words, the real relevant question that is not being addressed at all in this paragraph is whether or not those words actually take on any particular significance in the context in which they're being used. That is, in employing biblical language. That is, when this kind of biblical language is employed in that particular context of the Judeo-Christian worldview, do those terms take on a particular meaning? They don't address any of that. Oh, these are just general terms that could mean, just about anything. These means that these people were bad, and there isn't anything specific about their badness. You know, we certainly wouldn't want to go too far in identifying anything as actually specifically being bad. That's how a lot of these things go, but that's not the way that language works. No. Language, any given word in any given languages can have multiple meanings. But that doesn't mean it has any meaning that you want it to have in any general case. No. A word, though it does have a general meaning and a general range of meanings, it will take on specific meaning in specific contexts and according to specific contextual rules. And so the general terms here and their general meanings is not relevant to a document that is written from a Judeo-Christian worldview 2,000 years ago. You're going to have to ask, what did it mean at that time and that place for those speakers with that background? And the general meaning isn't very general anymore when you do that. All right. Then the Wikipedia article goes on to say the authenticity of the passage is in doubt. Scholars and theologians have proposed its being part of a larger non-Pauline interpolation. Okay. I can guarantee you that that is nothing but the blowing of smoke on that one. If you want to talk about the actual field of textual criticism, where you're actually dealing with reconstructing an ancient text and figuring out what is original and what isn't, what is missing, what needs to be put in, all those kinds of things, there are standards of evidence that are used in the actual field of textual criticism. And in those cases where we have texts that have an abundance of hard data, where we have an abundance of hard evidence itself, the three basic standards that are used for the introduction of material into consideration are original language manuscripts, early translations of those original language manuscripts, and also early quotations of that material that occurs in other writings. Okay, those are the three sources of hard evidence from which you derive all of your data in the field of textual criticism when you're dealing with documents that are both attested at an early stage and broadly attested. And when it comes to ancient documents, the Bible blows all of the others out of the water when it comes to those standards. It is both the earliest attested ancient document that we have, meaning that from the time that it was written to the time that we have our earliest extant original language manuscript is shorter for the New Testament than for practically any other work of ancient antiquity. And then on top of that, not only do we have our earliest evidence for the New Testament relevant to everything else, we also have the broadest attestation possible, meaning that we have more of this hard evidence for the New Testament than for any other work of ancient antiquity. And so what an actual textual critic will do, who's actually sensitive to standards of data, unlike a lot of people who just simply don't like Christianity and use their degrees as an excuse to propound that hatred of Christianity. But what people who are actually trying to be reasonable do in cases where you have ancient documents that have both very, very early attestation and very broad attestation is that they limit themselves to those sources. Those are the primary sources. And if you cannot find a basis for such in those early sources, then you don't go there. That is, if none of the original language manuscripts are missing this particular interpolation, as Wikipedia calls it. It's part of a larger non-Pauline interpolation. Well, are there any original language manuscripts that are missing this particular portion? Would be the first thing that an actual textual critic would say, and their answer is no. And then the next thing after that is, well, are there any early translations that are missing this particular section? And the answer is no. Okay, how about for early quotations? When we look at early quotations of this document, are there any early quotations that omit this material? And again, the answer is no. And as far as the hard data on that, that's relatively easy to find. There are many works that have been done with it. I happen to have a couple with me. One of them is this work right here, A Commentary on the Manuscripts and Text of the New Testament by Philip Wesley Comfort. And in this particular document, Philip Wesley Comfort documents a lot of the early manuscripts of the New Testament, and he also goes through and he talks about a lot of the variations that occur in the New Testament manuscripts and early data from the Church Fathers and quotations and early translations and all those kinds of things. And he goes through and he lists all of the significant variants. And if Romans 1:26 through 27 was missing, that would certainly be a significant early variance. But, what page is this? On page 301, let's see here. Trying to make it so you guys can see here. It's always a little hard to get this to work, but yeah, that's not too bad. Alright, but on the relevant page where it could have Romans 1:26 through 27 listed, you'll see it has 1:9b, 1:11, 2:16, but a large interpolation that would include 1:26 through 27 that they're talking about in the Wikipedia article is non-existent. There is no hard data, according to Philip Wesley Comfort, that would substantiate that. But Philip Wesley Comfort is not alone. Another document that records these kinds of things is the Greek New Testament 5th Revised Edition with dictionary by the United Bible Societies. That's what this is. And the United Bible Society's text is one that was developed specifically for translators and includes textual variation that is significant to translation. If Romans 1:26 through 27 was not original, that would show up. But on their germane page, on page 504, right here, at the bottom of the page, it does not have any textual footnotes for that. The textual notes that it has there are cross-references to different passages that have similar terminology. It's on the other page that you actually get some of the textual variants. But that doesn't occur on the page in question. Okay. There is no actual source out there that deals with hard data, hard evidence, the original language manuscripts themselves, the early versions, all of the early quotations that actually list this as being something that was missing, as being some kind of an interpolation. There is no hard evidence whatsoever that this is an interpolation. So on what basis are people saying that it's an interpretation? Because Wikipedia has to have sources. They have the little 6 here, and they have some people listed, you know, Percy Neal Harrison, Robert Martyr Hawkins, and all these other things, you know. These people seem to think that it's some kind of an interpolation, or at least the people who put this Wikipedia article together are saying that there's some kind of a basis for saying that this is an interpolation here. On what evidence do they do that? Well, we looked at the sources that deal with the hard data of manuscripts and early translations and early quotations, and those sources don't list it. So what kind of sources do they have for saying that this is an interpolation? Well, when it comes right down to it, it's nothing but opinion. That is, in the estimate of these so-called experts, the way that this particular part of the passage flows doesn't really quite seem to mesh with what we understand Paul to be saying in other places, or what we understand Paul's style to be in other places, and therefore it must not be original. That is an argument from what is called stylometry, an argument from style. And the problem with stylometry is that it is basically fake science. It's right up there with astrology in terms of reliability. The idea that you can analyze someone's style and analyze someone's intent and on that basis be able to identify which writings that have been put forth as being from a particular author actually are from that author has been debunked so many times it's not even funny. But since people never seem to get the gist, we'll go ahead and we'll recount some of the issues here. When it comes specifically to stylometry, and you're saying, okay, this particular author tends to do this with these particular words and prefers this kind of word order and this frequency of word use, so on and so forth, you have to make a lot of assumptions that may not be appropriate, especially for ancient works. One of them is that you have to have the direct speech of the author involved. When it comes to a lot of ancient documents, though, that doesn't really apply because a lot of ancient documents were written, at least in part, sometimes it was mixed, a lot of times it would be entirely, but a lot of ancient documents were written through what is called an amanuensis, basically a fancy name for a scribe. And so what would happen is, and you have to understand that at the time, literacy was fairly low, and so you would have particular people in a community, and that was their job to be the scholar. It was their job to be the ones who read and could read and write and those kinds of things, and would do official transactions and those kinds of things, and write official memos and those sorts of things. And they were the ones with the good penmanship and all that. And so if you wanted to write a letter to someone, you didn't pull out your own parchment in your own home and take out your pencil and write a letter. No, instead you went down to the amanuensis who was closest to you, and you paid him for your services, because various parchments and papyri and other things that people would write on would be relatively expensive, and it's not something that you would just have laying around your house most of the time. And so if you wanted to write a nice letter to someone, you needed to get, good material, and there's only certain people that would have access to this good material. It would be the amanuensis. So you'd go them and you pay them for the material, and then you're also going to pay them to do this job for you. And that includes writing it out for you, and they're going to have nice, pretty calligraphy, and it's going to look good and all those kinds of things, and, well, at least depending on how much you pay them. If you don't pay them very well, that might be a little bit sloppy, readable, but sloppy. You're only going to get what you pay for to a certain extent. And so you're going to be basically dictating what you want to say to this person, and they're going to be writing it down. And they're going to be writing it down in a form that is appropriate to writing, and this actually happens in the modern age as well. The way that people speak and the way that people write is not the same, stylistically speaking. And when we look at ancient documents, there are parts of the documents that will sound very much so like direct speech, and there are parts of it that will be modified for the conventions of written language. And that's just because it was going through an amanuensis who was putting it into written language. And then after you would finish dictating this thing, the amanuensis would read it back to you and would say, is this okay? And so what would happen is you would have the original person's dictation, the amanuensis modifying it to meet the required structure for a written document, and then the two agreeing in the end that this conveys the original meaning. It might not be the exact verbiage that was originally given, but it conveys the original meaning that was given, and then it would be sent out. We know that Paul used amanuenses from time to time, and that they're even mentioned in the New Testament. And because of that, you don't have direct material from Paul. And so trying to argue on the basis of style from Paul isn't really valid. There are certain places in certain texts where Paul says, see with what large letters I write and those kinds of things. But there are, like I said, other times where he very clearly uses an amanuensis and mentions these people. So we don't really have direct speech from Paul. Instead, you're going to have a mixture of styles. You're going to have Paul and whoever his amanuensis was at the time, and the amanuensis would usually change from location to location. Very few amanuenses were traveling. They didn't find some guy who had a lot of letters to write and just follow him around. That was generally not an overly reliable way to secure a practice and a job, and there's also a lot of times that these people did other things as well. Being a professional scribe in certain rural communities sometimes didn't pay all that well. In a bigger city, it's, you could be an official amanuensis for the legal system in the city and things like that, and then it wouldn't be so bad. But rule not so great. But yeah, it's just not consistent. You don't have direct language there. And even if you do have direct language, another problem that you have is that people's styles are demonstrably inconsistent. I mean, just looking at my own writing over the years, I take a look at my writing and my writing style in high school versus in college, not the same. Looking at my writing style now that I'm out of college, not the same. People's writing style will change, and they'll say, oh, well, in stylometry we identify these, certain non-transitional markers that have to do with how particular prepositions and articles and, non-education dependent words are used, and we'll try to measure those up. The only problem is that whenever they've tried to do measures of those things and apply it to literature and to that we have a known number of authors for, they almost always manage to get it wrong. Take, for example, the James Joyce canon, for example. All the things that have been written by James Joyce, stylometric analysis was applied to it. And if I remember correctly, the James Joyce canon, according to that particular stylometric method, resulted in something like the James Joyce canon belonging to 11 different authors, which is ridiculous because it was all from James Joyce. On another level that you might be able to relate to more, there are authors in history who have been able to style switch almost at the drop of a hat. And some of them are exceptionally good at them. One of the more famous ones is Mark Twain, his actual name being Samuel Clemens. But if you take a look at some of his works, he'll style shift radically from character to character. Take a look at like Huckleberry Finn, for example. The way that Huckleberry talks versus the other characters talks is noticeably stylistically different. And if you apply a stylometric analysis to each speaker, each identified speaker in the book, you're going to come to the conclusion that, there's at least half a different people that are represented here, if not more. But they're all from Samuel Clemens. They're all from Mark Twain. This idea of being able to identify interpolations based on stylistic consistencies or inconsistencies is absolute bupkis. It is absolutely fake science. It is right up there with astrology. Okay, and then another problem that you have with some kinds of analyses that will claim that these things are interpolations is that they'll claim that these are interpolations not based so much on stylistic concerns, but in terms of arguments that are being made in the text. This particular author is arguing for this particular thing, and this part of the text right here would defeat all of that, and so that can't actually be what he meant. Well, the assumption there is that you actually understood it correctly. The problem, though, with a lot of ancient documents is that modern man is really, really, really awful at determining the original meaning in a lot of cases. The problem with modern man is that he tends to put things in modern terms, and he wants to make things appealing to the modern man. Ancients weren't really concerned about the modern man at all. That was not their audience. They didn't care about what would be politically correct today. And so that really wasn't all that relevant to them. And there are plenty of cases in history where we look at things that have come from a historical time period, and to the present day reader or analyzer of such things will seem very incongruous and will automatically think that something must be wrong. For example, historically there are a couple of fairly famous biographies of the life of Jonathan Edwards, and the two biographies are actually pretty similar in a lot of regards in describing how Jonathan Edwards was raised, the general area in which he lived, the general circumstances of his death, even the title of major sermon that he preached before he died, and things like that. But one of the biographies puts his death in like the 1700s, and the other one puts his death in the 1800s. And so the modern person looking at this, encountering these two biographies of the life of Jonathan Edwards, would usually be tempted to say, well, one of these has to be wrong. because obviously you can't have someone who dies both in the 1700s and in the 1800s. We smart modern men, we know that, a person can't die in two different centuries. That just doesn't work. Well, okay, but assuming that you knew more than the people at the time is a dangerous thing. And in that particular case, if you look at some of the other biographies that were also written at the time, you come to find out that there were two guys that were called Jonathan Edwards. And they led very similar lives. But they died at two different times because it was two different people. But if you don't have that auxiliary information that the people at the time would have had, it's not going to make any sense to you. When it comes to, and of course Jonathan Edwards, when we talk about that, that's not really all that ancient. That's just a couple hundred years. That's not that far back. But even at that, we sometimes lose perspective. When it comes to ancient writings and even old writings, the general assumption from a classical conservative historical analysis has been to assume that the people at the time understood what they meant. Even if it doesn't make sense to you, they understood it, and it is our job to assume that their material, unless you have substantial evidence to the contrary, the default is basically innocent until proven guilty. These biographies seem to be in conflict with one another. Jonathan Edwards died in the 1700s. Jonathan Edwards died in the 1800s. That seems like it's in conflict. But conservative historians have come to the understanding that in cases like that, it is much safer to assume that the ancients understood their own time and place much better than we do. And so our job in trying to understand the material that comes down from them is to harmonize those points, to figure out how both could be true. And saying, well, it's possible that there was more than one person that was named Jonathan Edwards. It's a possibility, etc., etc. But you don't automatically assume that a difference implies guilt, that something must be wrong. That is not how good, solid, evidential, conservative, historical work is done. And the same thing with textual analysis. Like I said, textual, solid, historical, conservative, textual criticism is done on the basis of actual evidence. What do the manuscripts say? What do the early translations say? What do the early quotations say? The actual direct evidence. And if you don't have actual direct evidence for a given claim, you don't make the claim. But let's be honest. If you're trying to argue against Christianity, or most religions for that matter, to be fair, that's just not nearly as fun or as interesting. It is much more fun to play the part of the wild-eyed skeptic. I believe that the moon is flat, because when I look at it, I only see one set of colors. I've never seen the actual curvature of the moon. Somebody brings over a telescope and says, here, look at the curvature of the moon, look at the topography, it's not perfectly flat. Well, that's just how it looks in your lens. I mean, you can create all kinds of reasons for why the moon is actually perfectly flat despite all the evidence contrary to it. But conservative scientific research is evidence-based, and you don't contradict the evidence. Okay? The evidence, the actual hard evidence that we have in terms of manuscripts, early translations, and early quotations is that this particular passage is perfectly authentic. Now, does that mean that there aren't going to be people who argue against its originality? Of course there are people who argue against its originality. But is their basis for doing so actually grounded in solid evidence, or is it basically their own little theory tales, to use the phrasing of this friend of mine? And I happen to like his phrasing in that regard, certainly, because a lot of times it really is just theory tales. There's no hard data for any of this, but Woohoo! Stylometry! We found that there is a statistical difference between the style represented in this particular portion of text and this particular portion of text. So what? Is that a standard that you could apply consistently across the board into known cases? No. So why does it matter here? I don't know. Makes for a good story. That's pretty much it. Or, this part doesn't really seem to match the rest of it, and we'll get to that in the rest of the reading of this little snippet from Wikipedia here. But this doesn't happen to match other things that are said, and therefore, it must not be authentic. Well, you're assuming that you understood what was being argued for in the other parts. That is not how conservative historians do historical work of understanding historical text. The default assumption is that the ancients understood their time and place better than you do. And so if they say something that appears to be contradictory, the default is to give them the benefit of the doubt and to try to harmonize it. If you don't do that, you're not engaging in evidence-based historical work. Instead, what you're doing is nothing but theory tales. And that's what this little snippet from Wikipedia goes on to do. After they say, well, scholars and theologians have proposed that this passage is a part of a larger non-Pauline interpolation that does not show up in any hard data anywhere. And they say, furthermore, many contend that chapter 1, verses 18 through 32 represents not Paul's own position, but his summary of Hellenistic Jewish legalism. Calvin Porter, for example, concludes that in chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, as well as through Romans as a whole, Paul, as a part of his Gentile mission, challenges, argues against, and refutes both the content of the discourse of chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, and the practice of using such discourses. If that is the case, then the ideas in Romans 1, 18 through 32 are not Paul's. They are ideas which obstruct Paul's Gentile mission, theology, and practice. Okay, you've got a source, and frankly, it's possible to find sources for pretty much anything these days, even with people with lots of letters after their name. You'll find people with lots of letters after their name who believe that the earth is flat and things like that. Just because you can find people with letters behind their name who even manage to get published somewhere doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot these days. When it comes to this day and age, who said it isn't nearly as important as whether or not the argument actually has a solid basis or not. And the claim here is that Romans 1, chapter 1, verses 18 through 32 is at odds with Romans 2, 1 through 16 and various other passages. And again, as I've mentioned before, assuming that things are at odds because they seem to be at odds to you is not an indication that you're actually invested in evidentiary historical analysis. Instead, it means that you're already off in the realm of a theory tale somewhere, and to assume that they must be different. But to assume that since these things don't seem to be congruous to me, that they must mean that what Paul is doing is that he's, suddenly switching his hat around and playing the role of someone else, even where there's no indication in the text that he's playing someone else's role. It's reaching on a level that is just absolutely astounding. All right, enough of my tirade and rant. Thank you all very much for listening. For those of you who are in Christ, please go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to an understanding of the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.